The rain had been falling since noon, a slow and steady drizzle that turned the afternoon light thin and gray, laying a fine mist across the wide residential streets of one of the most affluent neighborhoods in the city. The maple trees lining the sidewalk had already begun to turn, their leaves burning in shades of amber and deep red, and they dripped quietly onto the wet pavement as the evening began to settle in. On a night like this, in a neighborhood like this, very little was supposed to go wrong. This was the kind of street where security cameras blinked from every gate, where neighbors knew one another by name, where packages were left safely on porches, and nobody ever questioned who belonged and who did not, or so it was supposed to be. A dark navy SUV pulled up slowly to the curb in front of a handsome two-story brick home at the far end of the block. The driver's side door opened. A black woman in her early 40s stepped out, pulling the collar of her plain charcoal overcoat a little tighter against the chill. She was carrying nothing but a thin leather folio tucked under one arm, and she tilted her face up briefly toward the sky, as if the cold rain on her skin was something she had been waiting for all day. She was not wearing a badge. She was not wearing a uniform. She was not surrounded by anyone. She simply walked toward her front gate with the quiet, composed ease of someone who had come home 1,000 times before because she had. And then, from half a block away, a patrol car turned the corner slowly, its headlights sweeping across the wet street, and the officer behind the wheel let his foot ease off the gas without quite knowing why. He looked at the woman. He looked at the house. And something in the small, locked room at the back of his mind told him that the picture did not add up. He pulled to the curb and sat for a moment, engine idling, rain ticking against the roof of the car. Then he reached for his door handle. What happened in the next 15 minutes would not stay on this quiet street. It would not stay in this city. It would not stay quiet at all. Ava Brooks had been awake since 4:30 that morning, which was not unusual for her. The Federal Anti-Corruption Task Force meeting had run well past 6 in the evening, and by the time the last briefing document was signed off and the last analyst had filed out of the conference room, the city outside the federal building's windows had gone almost completely dark. She had sat for a moment alone at the long table, looking at the wall where a map of the region was still pinned with color-coded markers, and she had felt the particular kind of tired that comes not from physical exhaustion, but from the weight of sustained concentration, the bone-deep fatigue of someone who had spent 14 hours thinking harder than most people ever do. She was 42 years old. She had worked her way up through the Bureau, over nearly 2 decades, through field assignments in 3 different cities, through 2 overseas postings she was not permitted to discuss, through a legal career before that which had taught her how to read a room and read a person with equal precision. She had been appointed regional director 3 years ago, and in that time she had overseen more than 40 federal prosecutions, restructured the office's entire counterintelligence division, and quietly built a reputation among her peers as someone who was as effective as she was unassuming. She did not like ceremony. She did not like motorcades. She had a standing request on file with her office that her personal vehicle was never to be escorted unless she specifically authorized it, and she meant it every single time. So, on that wet Tuesday evening, when her assistant had offered, as he always did, to arrange a bureau vehicle and a driver, she had simply picked up her keys and said what she always said. "Don't send a motorcade. I just want to go home." She had driven herself. A plain black SUV, personally registered, nothing about it that announced anything to anyone. She had taken the long way, looping through the older part of the district, the way she always did when she needed the drive to decompress, the hum of the engine and the sweep of the wipers doing their quiet, reliable work. She was thinking about the task force's findings. She was thinking about a paragraph in a deposition she had read that afternoon that had nagged at her all day. She was almost home before she was thinking about nothing in particular at all, and by the time she turned onto her street and saw the familiar shape of her front gate through the rain-streaked windshield, the tension in her shoulders had finally begun to ease. She parked at the curb, gathered her folio, and stepped out into the light rain. She did not see the patrol car. Not yet. Officer Daniel Carter had been on the force for 11 years, and in those 11 years he had developed what he privately considered an exceptional instinct for what he called reading a situation. He was not a cruel man in the way that word is sometimes used. He did not enjoy causing pain for its own sake, but he was a man who had never once, in 11 years, seriously examined the machinery behind his instincts. He had never asked himself where those readings came from, whose experience had shaped them, or whether the pattern matching he trusted so completely was something built from evidence or something built from something much older and much less reliable. He had grown up in a working-class suburb 20 miles from the city. He had joined the force at 27 after a brief stint in private security, and he had spent the better part of a decade on patrol in 2 of the city's lower-income districts. He was not a man without genuine professional accomplishments. He had a commendation for restraint filed in his record from 4 years ago. He had also, in that same record, 3 complaints related to conduct during traffic stops, none of which had resulted in formal discipline. He told himself those complaints were filed by people who did not like being held accountable. He believed that completely. When he saw Ava Brooks step out of her SUV in front of the large brick house on Harrington Lane, what he decided he saw in the fraction of a second before he had processed anything consciously, was a woman who did not belong. The neighborhood, the house, the car. He ran the calculation automatically, without awareness that he was doing it, and the answer came back wrong to him. He pulled to the curb. He got out of his patrol car. He walked toward her with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who had already decided the conclusion, and was now simply conducting the formality of arriving at it. He did not greet her. He did not say good evening. He did not introduce himself. He walked up behind her as she was reaching for the latch on the front gate and said, loudly enough that his voice carried through the drizzle, "Excuse me, hold on a second." Ava turned. She looked at him with the calm, measured attention of someone who had been in rooms far more confrontational than this and had survived every one of them. She waited. Carter looked her over from her feet to her face, a slow and deliberately assessing survey that he made no attempt to disguise. Then he said, "This your car?" She said yes. "You live here?" She said yes. "What's your name?" She told him. He asked again for her last name, and she gave it. He looked at the house behind her, and then back at her, and something shifted in his expression, not into aggression, not yet, but into the settled, self-assured certainty of someone who has decided he already knows what is happening. "This is your house," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," she said. "It is." He asked what she did for work. She said she worked for the federal government. He asked what that meant. She said she was with the Bureau. He asked which bureau. She looked at him for a moment. She said the Federal Bureau of Investigation. There was a silence in which the rain continued its indifferent business on the sidewalk between them. Carter's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He looked back at the house. A light was on upstairs. He looked back at her. And then, with a certainty that would define the rest of his career, he said, "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to not lie to me." What followed was methodical in the way that a certain kind of arrogance is always methodical, patient with itself, slow to doubt, absolutely certain of its own authority. Carter instructed her to step away from the gate. He told her to keep her hands where he could see them. He said he was going to need to see some identification, and when Ava reached slowly into her coat pocket and produced her driver's license, he studied it with an expression of concentrated skepticism, as though the document itself might be confessing something if he looked at it long enough. The address on the license matched the house behind her. He looked at the house. He looked at the license again. He handed it back without a word of acknowledgement. Then he told her he was going to need to take a look in the vehicle. She asked if she was being detained. He said he was just asking questions. She asked again, calmly, clearly, "Officer, am I being detained or am I free to go?" He told her she was being asked to cooperate. She told him she was cooperating, and she had been cooperating from the moment he approached her, and that if he had a lawful basis for detaining her, she would like to know what it was. He told her he had reason to believe the vehicle might be involved in a reported theft. She asked when this report had been filed and what the vehicle description was. He did not answer. He told her to step to the rear of the vehicle. Neighbors on the street had begun to take notice. A man walking his dog had stopped across the street and was watching. A woman on her porch, 2 houses down, had turned from her door. A teenager with a bicycle had stopped moving entirely, hands on the handlebars, head turned. Ava did not raise her voice. She did not make any sudden movements. She stood exactly where she was told to stand, and she watched Carter with the patient, absolute attention of someone who was recording everything, every word, every gesture, every second of it, somewhere precise and permanent behind her eyes. When Carter told her to place her hands on the trunk of the vehicle and spread her feet, she said, very quietly, but very clearly, "Officer, you are violating my Fourth Amendment rights. I am asking you one more time to verify my identity through your dispatch system before you go any further." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I decide what goes any further, out here." He reached for his handcuffs. The click of the cuffs was the sound that pulled the street into a completely different register. 3 neighbors were now visibly watching. 2 of them had their phones out. One woman had walked down to the edge of her driveway and was standing there in the drizzle, not speaking, just watching with her arms crossed. Carter walked Ava toward the patrol car with one hand on her arm, and as he did, he said in a voice pitched just loud enough to carry, "Another one claiming to own property she's got no business being near." He was not speaking to her. He was speaking to nobody in particular, which was somehow worse. Ava said nothing. She allowed herself to be placed in the back seat of the patrol car. She sat straight. She kept her breathing controlled. She looked through the rain-blurred window at the front gate of her own house, which she had not yet passed through, and she thought with clear, surgical focus about what was going to happen next and in what order and to whom. Carter got on his radio. He called in the stop. He gave the plate number. While he waited for a return, he stood outside the patrol car in the rain, with his arms folded, looking at the house as though trying to solve it. The dispatch came back. The vehicle was registered. No flags. No warrants. Nothing. He frowned at the radio. He told dispatch to run it again. The answer was the same. He stood there in the rain for another moment, and in that moment, in the wet and the dark and the amber glow of the streetlights, the gap between what he had decided and what was actually true began to stretch wider than he had ever allowed it to stretch before, and he did not know what to do with it. So he did what people in that position often do. He kept going. He got in the car. He started it. He drove her to the station. The processing area at the 14th District Station was not a particularly large or dramatic space. A worn linoleum floor under fluorescent lights, a long counter with a plexiglass partition, a row of molded plastic chairs bolted to the wall. It smelled of coffee and paper, and something faintly chemical from the cleaning crew that had come through an hour before. When Carter walked Ava through the back entrance, 2 of the officers on desk duty looked up. Neither said anything immediately. Carter guided her toward the processing counter with the efficient, slightly self-congratulatory manner of someone delivering a result he was proud of, and he said to the officer at the desk that he had a possible vehicle theft and identity fraud situation. Ava stood beside him without expression. A younger officer, he could not have been more than 3 years on the job, looked up from a clipboard and said carefully, "Do you want to run a check on her?" Carter said he would handle the paperwork first. He said the system could wait. He took her phone, he placed it in a property bag, and Ava, for the first time since any of this had begun, looked directly at the young officer in a way that he would remember for the rest of his career, not threatening, not pleading, just clear, just completely and undeniably present, as if she were making sure that he specifically understood that she was there and that she was watching and that this moment was real and documented. Carter turned to a colleague he had known for 6 years and spoke in a low, satisfied voice. "Got one claiming she owns a 4-bedroom on Harrington Lane. Federal employee, she says." His colleague raised his eyebrows. "Not in agreement." Exactly more in the way a person raises their eyebrows when they are not sure what they are being asked to validate. Carter did not notice the distinction. He continued, "Documents could easily be fabricated. Whole neighborhoods been seeing activity." His colleague said nothing. Ava sat in the chair she had been directed toward. She sat straight. She folded her hands in her lap. She waited. The fluorescent lights hummed. The desk officer shuffled papers. And somewhere across town, in a building that Carter had no reason to be thinking about, a system had just been triggered that he absolutely should have been thinking about. When the fingerprinting technician came to process Ava, it was a routine step in a routine process, or it was supposed to be. The technician was a civilian employee named Marcus, who had been working in forensic processing at the 14th for 9 years and had run thousands of prints through the federal integration system in that time. He rolled her right thumb first, as protocol required, then her index finger, and submitted the scan. The system took about 45 seconds to cross-reference. Marcus had his back to the main room while he worked, and he was about to start on the second hand when the screen in front of him changed. The background went from the usual gray to a deep crimson. A single line of text appeared across the top. Federal security clearance restricted access. And then the record loaded. Marcus read it once. He read it again. He turned around slowly in his chair and looked at the room as though he were trying to determine whether he was still in the same building he had been in 30 seconds ago. He looked at the woman sitting in the molded plastic chair with her hands folded in her lap, completely still, completely calm, watching him with an expression that told him she already knew exactly what he had just found. He looked at the name on the screen. He looked at the title below it. He looked at the federal seal beside the file number. He stood up from his chair without fully deciding to. He said, in a voice that came out much quieter than he had intended, "Can someone get Sergeant Grant? Right now, please." He did not look at Carter when he said it. Sergeant Melissa Grant had been on her way out to the parking lot when her radio crackled with the request to come back inside. She was a 20-year veteran, a compact woman in her early 50s, with close-cropped gray at her temples, and the kind of permanently calibrated alertness that comes from 2 decades of managing situations that could go wrong in about 40 different ways. She walked back through the door, took one look at Marcus's expression, and felt something drop in her stomach before she had even seen the screen. She walked to his terminal. She read what was on it. She stood very still for about 4 seconds. Then she turned and looked at the woman in the plastic chair, and the woman looked back at her with exactly the patience of someone who had been waiting for this precise moment since the handcuffs clicked. Sergeant Grant looked at Carter. Carter was sitting at a desk across the room, filling out paperwork with the slow, self-assured deliberateness of a man who has decided the evening is going exactly as planned. She said his name. He looked up. She said, "Come here." He came over, taking his time about it. She stepped back from the terminal and gestured at the screen. He looked, and the color drained from Daniel Carter's face in the slow, irreversible way that color drains from things that will not recover it. For a moment, Carter did not speak. Then he said the machine was wrong. He said it with the conviction of a man who needs very badly for a machine to be wrong, who is, in fact, gambling everything on it. Sergeant Grant told him she was going to run it again. She ran it again. The screen returned the same result in 43 seconds. The same red background, the same restricted access banner, the same name, the same title, the same federal seal, unchanged and unambiguous and entirely, perfectly correct. Carter said there must be a glitch in the federal integration. He said it was known to have errors. He said he had personally seen it pull wrong records before. Sergeant Grant was no longer looking at the screen. She was looking at him. She said, "Daniel, stop talking." He stopped. The room had gone very quiet, in the way rooms go quiet when everyone in them has just understood something simultaneously, and none of them are quite sure what to do with the understanding. The young officer who had suggested running a check earlier was now standing near the door to the hallway, very still, looking at the floor. Marcus had turned his chair back to his terminal and appeared to be studying it with great concentration. The desk officer behind the plexiglass had set down her pen. Ava Brooks sat in her chair. She had not moved. She had not changed expression. She had not said anything since she sat down, and she did not say anything now. She simply waited, with a composure so complete and so deliberately maintained that it communicated something far more devastating than anger would have. Sergeant Grant walked to the hallway and made a phone call. She made it quietly, away from the main room, and when she came back, Her expression had tightened into the particular look of someone who has just been told that the situation is significantly worse than they had already understood it to be. She looked at Carter. She said, "You need to sit down and not do anything else until I tell you to." He started to say something. She said, "Sit down." He sat. Across the city, on the 14th floor of the federal building on Meridian Avenue, the first alert had come through 12 minutes after Ava's phone had been placed in a property bag and gone offline. The FBI's communications protocol had a standing tripwire. If the regional director's device went dark in a non-cleared location without prior authorization or a check-in code, the system flagged it automatically. Special Agent Derek Holloway, who was on duty that evening in the operations center, saw the flag and pulled up the last known GPS position of the device. It had gone dark, at a fixed location, 11 minutes ago. He cross-referenced the address with federal databases. It returned as a police station, the 14th District. He stared at the screen for 3 seconds. He reached for his desk phone. He called Deputy Director Michael Reynolds' direct line. Reynolds was at home, eating dinner, and he picked up on the second ring. Holloway told him what he had. Reynolds put down his fork. He asked 2 questions. He got 2 answers. Then he told Holloway to initiate the protocol and that he was on his way. The officer down protocol was not a gentle escalation. It was not a series of polite phone calls. It was a full activation response designed for situations in which a senior federal officer's safety could not be confirmed, and it moved with the speed and scale of something that had been designed, practiced, and refined over years of contingency planning. Within 4 minutes of Reynolds' authorization, Special Agent Lisa Monroe had her team in motion. She was the head of the Regional Rapid Response Unit, 36 years old, former Army, 2 federal commendations, and a reputation in the office for being the person you called when you needed something resolved correctly the first time. She took the briefing on the move. Director Brooks, missing. Last location, 14th District Station. No information on status, circumstances, or threat level. Monroe told her team to treat it as an active situation until they had eyes on the director and could confirm otherwise. They moved. 22 black SUVs left the federal building's underground garage in a coordinated convoy that moved through the wet city streets with a precision that attracted attention at every intersection. They did not use sirens. They did not need to. The vehicles themselves, the number, the formation, the federal plates, the speed, all of it communicated something that sirens would have only diluted. They moved through 3 districts in 11 minutes and pulled up in front of the 14th District Station from 2 directions simultaneously, occupying the street and the adjacent parking area in a deployment that was over before most of the officers inside had processed what they were hearing through the windows. Special agents in dark jackets, with the letters FBI in yellow on the back, stepped out and established a perimeter that was professional and absolute. No one was shouting. No weapons were visible and drawn. This was not a show of aggression. It was something more unsettling than aggression. It was a show of authority so thorough and so unhurried that it left no interpretive room at all. Sergeant Grant was at the front desk when the vehicles pulled up, and she walked to the door and looked out, and what she saw confirmed everything her stomach had been telling her for the past 8 minutes. She pushed the door open. Lisa Monroe was already walking up the front steps, badge out, moving with the particular steadiness of someone who has spent a long time training for moments that require steadiness. Monroe reached the door. She looked at Grant. She held up her identification. She said, "We're here for Director Brooks. Where is she?" Sergeant Grant said, "Please come in." And then she stood aside. The station's interior changed the moment Monroe and her team entered it. Not because of anything dramatic. No raised voices, no weapons, no commands shouted across the room. It changed because of the way a space changes when the people who enter it are the ones who now, unambiguously, and without any possibility of dispute, hold the authority in it. Monroe's agents fanned out with a quiet efficiency that was itself a kind of statement. 2 of them went directly to the processing area. 2 more positioned themselves near the entrance to the holding corridor. Monroe herself walked to the center of the main room and stood there, and every officer in the room looked at her, and she looked back at them, one by one, briefly, and without hostility, and the message she delivered in that silence was entirely clear. She said, "To no one and everyone, I want Director Brooks brought out now. I want every camera that was active in this building and on that street secured, and I want everyone who had contact with her tonight to stay exactly where they are." It took approximately 90 seconds for Ava Brooks to be escorted from the processing area and through the door into the main room. She was uncuffed. Now someone had had the presence of mind to remove the restraints in the last few frantic minutes, and she walked out of the processing area the same way she had sat in the plastic chair, and the same way she had stood on her own front walk in the rain. Straight-backed, unhurried, absolutely composed. Monroe looked at her. Something passed between them, a look that was not relief, exactly, and not anger, exactly, but something that encompassed both of those things and moved through them quickly on its way to something more purposeful. Monroe said, "Director Brooks." Ava said, "Agent Monroe, thank you for the response time." Monroe almost smiled. "Are you injured?" "No. Do you need anything immediately?" Ava looked across the room at Daniel Carter, who was sitting at a desk near the far wall. He was looking at the floor. He looked like a man who has just watched every certainty he has ever held about himself walk out of the room. "No," Ava said. "I'm fine. Let's get to work." The work, in the hours and days that followed, would involve a great number of people and a great many documents. But in the room that night, the first and most immediate work was evidentiary. Monroe's team requested every piece of footage from every source that had any sightline on what had happened since Carter's patrol car had turned onto Harrington Lane. The body camera footage from Carter's vest, the dash cam from the patrol vehicle. The city maintained traffic camera at the intersection 2 blocks from the house. 3 separate private security cameras from neighboring properties on Harrington Lane, all of which had been running on motion sensor activation since the SUV pulled up to the curb. The footage, when it was compiled and reviewed in sequence, told a story that was not ambiguous in any of its details. It showed Ava Brooks stepping out of her vehicle. It showed her walking toward her gate. It showed Carter's patrol car pulling to the curb. It showed him approaching her. It showed the entire exchange at the gate, every question, every answer, every moment in which she complied with his instructions, every moment in which he ignored her requests to verify her identity through standard channels, every moment in which he escalated a situation that had no lawful basis for escalation. It showed him placing the cuffs on her. It showed the neighbors watching. It showed him saying clearly audible, on his own body camera audio, another one claiming to own property she's got no business being near. It showed her being placed in the patrol car. It showed all of it in sequence, from multiple angles, without a gap. Monroe reviewed the footage with 2 of her agents and Sergeant Grant. Grant sat through the entire compilation without speaking. When it was over, she put both hands flat on the table and looked at the screen, which had returned to the paused image of Ava at the gate, and she exhaled a slow breath that seemed to carry with it a great deal of weight. She said, "I should have been faster." Monroe said nothing. There was nothing to say that the footage had not already said more precisely. Internal Affairs arrived at 45 minutes past midnight. The Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice was formally notified at 1:15 in the morning. The city's legal counsel was reached by phone at 1:40 and arrived at the station by 2. Daniel Carter was removed from active duty at 11:47 that night, approximately 90 minutes after Monroe's team had entered the building. His service weapon and his badge were taken by Sergeant Grant, who did it without ceremony and without comment, and Carter did not resist and did not speak. He had, by that point, attempted twice to speak to Ava directly, and both times had been redirected by Monroe's agents. The third time, he was not given the opportunity to try. At approximately 2 in the morning, with the evidentiary collection well underway and the various legal and administrative chains of communication fully activated, Carter was brought to a room where Ava was present along with Monroe, an internal affairs officer, and a representative from the city's legal team. He had clearly been composing something during the hours he had been sitting. He began by saying that he had made a mistake in judgment. He said he understood that things had gotten out of hand. He said he wanted to apologize for any inconvenience he had caused, And Ava, who had sat through 11 hours of federal meetings and 63 minutes of unlawful detention and 2 hours of evidentiary review, all on the same day without raising her voice once, leaned forward slightly and asked him a single question. She said, "If today I were not the director of the FBI, if I were simply a black woman in a good coat standing in front of a house on Harrington Lane, what would you have done with me?" The room was quiet. Carter opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the table. No one spoke. The silence stretched for so long that it began to take on a shape of its own, a presence in the room as solid and as honest as anything that had been said all night. No one answered the question. No one could. And in that silence, which was the silence of something true being recognized and not being able to be unsaid, the real weight of the evening finally settled across the shoulders of everyone in that room who deserved to feel it. The investigation that followed moved quickly, as investigations do when the evidence is complete and the weight of the institution behind it is significant. The Internal Affairs Review was officially opened the morning after the incident. The Civil Rights Division began its parallel inquiry within 48 hours. The city's Police Oversight Board, which had been notified, along with the legal team in the early morning hours, convened an emergency session within 3 days. Witness statements were taken from 11 neighbors who had observed part or all of the street stop. The footage from all 6 camera sources was formally entered into the evidentiary record. Carter's personnel file was reviewed, and the 3 prior complaints related to his conduct during traffic stops, the ones that had been filed and closed without formal discipline, were re-examined in the context of the new material. The pattern they described, once seen alongside what the cameras had captured on Harrington Lane, was neither surprising nor complicated. It was simply there, documented, waiting to be acknowledged. Within 3 weeks, Daniel Carter was formally terminated from the department. The termination letter cited a list of violations that ran to 4 pages, and the section on the Harrington Lane incident took up nearly half of it. Criminal charges were filed through the city's district attorney's office in coordination with the Federal Civil Rights Division, and Carter retained private counsel and entered a not guilty plea. The proceedings would take considerably longer than 3 weeks, but the direction of them was not a matter of serious uncertainty to anyone who had reviewed the footage. Sergeant Grant was not terminated. She received a formal letter of reprimand for her failure to intervene at the station before the evidentiary check confirmed Ava's identity. It was a document she would later describe, in a statement to the Oversight Board, as entirely fair. She said she had known something was wrong the moment she walked into the processing area and saw the room. She said she had not acted on that knowledge quickly enough. She said she was sorry for that, and she meant it in a way that was specific and professional, and did not ask for absolution. The 14th District Station, and, more broadly, the City Police Department did not emerge from the investigation unchanged. The Oversight Board's recommendations, which were adopted in full by the department superintendent within 6 weeks, included a mandatory revision of the identity verification protocol requiring a database cross-check before any arrest or extended detention could be completed without a named complainant or observed criminal act. They included a required training curriculum on implicit bias for all patrol officers, the first such training in the department's history, to be developed in partnership with an external civil rights organization rather than internally. They included a new escalation review process that gave shift sergeants explicit authority and explicit responsibility to intervene in any street stop that did not have a documented lawful basis. And they included a formal acknowledgement language that the Oversight Board's chair described as unprecedented in their records, that the incident on Harrington Lane had not been an isolated failure of one individual officer, but a failure of a system that had allowed biases to operate without check, and a failure of a culture that had treated certain assumptions about certain people as professional instinct rather than as prejudice. The department superintendent signed the implementation order on a Thursday morning in mid-November, and the coverage it received was substantial, and the coverage was warranted. The changes were real. Whether they would prove durable was the question that always accompanied real changes, the one that history answered slowly, and that required sustained attention to answer well. But they were real, and they had happened, and that was not nothing. Ava Brooks did not give a press conference in the immediate aftermath of the incident. She declined 3 invitations from national broadcast outlets, 1 written request from a major newspaper for a personal essay, and 2 separate offers from advocacy organizations to speak at events that would have given her a significant public platform. She was not, her office communicated politely through proper channels, interested in using what had happened to her as the basis for a public performance of outrage. She had work to do. The Anti-Corruption Task Force had a filing deadline in December. There were 3 pending federal prosecutions that required her attention. There were 2 new analysts in the Counterintelligence Division who needed structured oversight during their first quarter. She had a department to run, and she ran it, and she did not let the incident on Harrington Lane become the thing her work was about, because her work had never been about her, and she had no intention of letting it become so now. She did make one brief statement, approximately 3 weeks after the incident, when the department's implementation order had been signed and the investigation's initial findings had been made public. She made it in the courtyard of the federal building on a gray November morning, without notes, standing in front of about a dozen journalists and a small number of department officials and colleagues who had asked to be present. She spoke for approximately 4 minutes. She said that she did not think what had happened to her was unusual, and that was precisely the problem. She said that what had made her experience different from the experiences of other Black women who had been stopped, detained, and humiliated in front of their own homes was not the conduct of the officer. The conduct had been entirely representative of a pattern that was well documented and long established. What had made it different was what happened afterward. What happened when the badge number came back, and the system returned a result that certain people in that station had been confident it would never return. She paused for a moment. She said, "A badge doesn't build character. A title doesn't build integrity. What builds both of those things is the choices we make about how to treat people who are in front of us, especially people who can't make us pay a price for mistreating them, or people we think can't." She stopped. A reporter called out a question. She said she had said what she came to say, and she walked back inside. There is a particular quality to the light on a November afternoon in the northeastern United States, in the hour or so before true dark settles in, when the sky is the color of pewter and the clouds have that specific, saturated thickness. That means the cold has arrived and is not leaving. The maple trees on Harrington Lane had dropped most of their leaves by the time Ava drove back down the block on the Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the incident, and the wet pavement had that clean, mineral smell of rain that has already passed through and left the air clarified. She parked at the curb in front of her house, in the same spot she had parked on the evening of the incident. She sat for a moment with the engine off and the windows beginning to fog slightly at the edges. There were no other vehicles on the block besides those belonging to her neighbors, all of whom she knew by name. There were no cameras outside her gate, not that evening. There was no escort. There was no story in that moment. Or rather, there was only the most ordinary kind of story. A woman coming home after a long day's work, tired, in the good and purposeful way of someone who has spent their energy on something that mattered, sitting for a moment in the quiet of her own car before going inside. She got out. She pulled her coat collar up against the November air. She walked to the gate, put her hand on the latch, and opened it. The light was on in the upstairs window, the same light that had been on that other night, and the front walk was clear, and the door was waiting. She went inside. The city continued its business around her. The investigation continued its careful, necessary work. The department's new protocols took effect the following Monday, and the question that Ava had asked in a room at 2 a.m, the question that no one had been able to answer because it did not have an answer that anyone in that room was willing to say aloud, continued to move through the city the way a stone moves through water. Long after the stone has settled, the rings keep going outward, reaching the edges of things that seemed entirely still, disturbing a surface that had been comfortable in its stillness, and making clear, to anyone paying attention, that the water was never as undisturbed as it had appeared. The question itself was not complicated. It was not a riddle or a paradox or a philosophical exercise designed to have no resolution. It was, in fact, The simplest kind of question the kind children ask, without knowing they are asking something profound, the kind that sounds rhetorical, until you sit with it long enough to understand that it demands a real answer. If you did not know who I was, how would you have treated me? That was all. And the reason no one in that room had answered it, the reason the silence had stretched and stretched until it became something tangible, was not that the answer was unknown. It was that the answer was known. It had been known for a very long time. It was known in the records of every complaint filed against officers who were never disciplined. It was known in the data that civil rights organizations had compiled across decades, the statistics that showed who got stopped, and how often, and for what, and with what outcome. It was known in the individual, private knowledge of every black woman who had ever walked toward her own front door and felt the specific awareness of being watched in a way that assumed the worst. The answer to Ava's question was not something that needed to be discovered. It needed to be admitted. And what the incident on Harrington Lane had done, what the cameras and the fingerprint system and the 22 black SUVs and the 4-page termination letter and the oversight board's unanimous recommendations had, all done together, was make it slightly harder, for a while at least, for that admission to be deferred. Not impossible to defer. History was full of deferrals, full of moments that seemed decisive and turned out to be insufficient, of reforms that took hold and then gradually loosened, of acknowledged wrongs that were apologized for without being addressed. The question of whether this moment would be different was not a question that one evening, however dramatic, could answer. It was a question that institutions answer over years, through decisions made in ordinary rooms by people who are not being watched by anyone, through the slow accumulation of policies that are either honored or quietly abandoned. It was a question, in other words, that required exactly the kind of sustained, unglamorous, non-televised attention that Ava Brooks had given her entire professional life, not to any single crisis, but to the underlying structures that allowed crises to keep happening. She understood this better than anyone in that courtyard on the November morning when she made her statement. She understood it because she had spent 20 years inside those structures, learning where the gaps were, and how things fell through them, and what it took, what it actually, practically, unglamorously took, to close a gap enough that fewer things fell. A badge doesn't build character. What builds it is the choices we make when no one is watching who can hold us accountable. That was the truth of the evening on Harrington Lane. That was the truth that Daniel Carter had lived by without examining it, and that the cameras had made visible, and that the city was now, slowly and imperfectly, trying to reckon with. It was not a comfortable truth. It was not supposed to be. Truth of that kind rarely is, and the discomfort of it is, in some essential way, the point. By December, the task force filing was complete. The federal prosecution Ava had been monitoring delivered its first indictment the week before Christmas. 2 of the new analysts she had been supervising had their first solo case assignments approved before the end of the year. The work continued, as it always had, as it always would. Ava drove herself to the federal building every morning in the same plain black SUV. She took the long way when she needed to decompress. She answered her own phone. She declined motorcades. She came home on evenings when the sky was the color of pewter and the maples were bare and the front walk was wet, and she put her hand on the gate latch and she went inside. And if there were moments in the processing area of a police station in the middle of the night, or in a courtyard on a gray November morning, or in the quiet of her own car with the engine off, when the weight of what she carried and what she had survived, and what she continued to refuse to be reduced by pressed down on her with something that was not anger and not despair, but something that encompassed both and asked to be felt, she felt it. She felt it fully, and then she set it down, and then she went back to work. Because that was the other truth of who she was, and what she had built, and what she had decided, a long time ago, that her life was going to be about. Not the moments of injustice, though those were real, not the vindication, though that had been real too, but the thing that came after both of those, the ordinary, essential, quiet work of making the structures hold, one decision at a time, in rooms that no one was watching, for people she would never personally meet, but whose lives would be shaped by whether she got it right. There was a version of this story that ended with the handcuffs, with the humiliation in front of neighbors, with the cold plastic chair under fluorescent light. There was a version that ended with the red screen and the federal seal, and the 22 black vehicles arriving in the rain. There was even a version that ended with a quiet, 4-minute statement in a courtyard, with words that moved through a city like rings on still water. But the version that was truest, the one that required no cameras, no titles, no badge numbers returned by a federal database, was this one. A woman who had been wronged walking back through her own front gate on an ordinary evening, choosing to continue doing work that was larger than what had been done to her, because she understood, with the clear and unsparing intelligence that had defined her entire career, that justice is not a single event. It is a practice. It is daily. It is unglamorous and imperfect and absolutely necessary, and it belongs to everyone, or it belongs to no one at all.